Well, why are innocent Americans being placed on terror watch lists? Why are Christians being watched by the FBI, Catholics being watched by the FBI as a grave threat to the United States? I could ask 20 more questions, and God knows we'd have a 3-hour show if I asked those questions about innocent Americans being illegally surveilled, targeted, but it would, of course, take me all night. Our next guest, though, is a former FBI special agent, Kyle Seraphin, who worked in counterintelligence until he uncovered some chicanery, some corruption, some criminality and the behavior by the FBI. Then he blew the whistle, told members of Congress what the FBI was doing. And then what do you think happened? Well, shortly after he blew the whistle, he was indefinitely suspended for telling the truth. Now he's on a mission to expose the corruption at the FBI and these government agencies. And we're honored to have a true American patriot on our show. Kyle, welcome to Redacted. Great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me on. I feel like being on a mission is a good thing. It feels good to hear that. I sometimes wonder what I'm doing.
Right. Well, when we wake up in the morning, what are we doing, right? Trying to at least expose and get to the heart of the matter and share this truth with the American public. And of course, with your Rumble show and with your audience, you're trying to do that every day. And I imagine, having been in the belly of the beast, so to speak, it gives you an enormous perspective on what we're seeing right now. And I wanted to have you on the show for a while to talk about the corruption at the FBI, your crusade to stop it. And we'll get to that in a minute. But over the past few days, we've actually gotten some breaking news that I want to get your context on first before we get more into your story and your history. From the TSA, placing innocent Americans on a terror watch list, and the federal air marshals sitting quietly nearby on flights because these Americans who were in Washington, D.C. or near Washington, D.C. on January 6th are the gravest threat to America, and therefore need to be placed on terror watch lists. The inability to travel freely, which is a constitutional right, and federal air marshals sitting by watching their every movement. What do we know about this story? This sounds like an absolute outrage, and I think most Americans have no idea that this is actually happening. What do we know about this?
So basically, we know all of this stuff because of a group of people that are a private organization that represent, in sort of like a legal way, the Federal Air Marshal Service. This is known as the FAMS inside the law enforcement community. And one in particular, a woman named Sonia Labasco, has come forward and kind of been their figurehead. The group is called the Air Marshals National Council. It's like an advocacy group, or it's not quite a union, but something to that effect. And they have been trying to dig into what happened to their agency. They obviously have been around for a very long time. They got a big juice, kind of a steroidal boost that happened after 9/11 to follow potential hijackers and protect the American airways. And since the January 6th, riot that happened at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., their mission has shifted dramatically to the point where they're not doing the mission that they had done for the last 20 years. They are no longer following international potential terrorists. They're following around American citizens who just happen to be on flight manifests flying into the National Capital Region, like between January 4th and January 7th of 2021. Now, it doesn't seem like a very good use of federal resources. These are highly trained federal agents that work in a linear combat environment. That's what a plane is. That's what a bus or a train is. And there's not a lot of people that train specifically for that mission set to be able to take back a plane. That's why you have federal air marshals. And so now they're just sitting around doing surveillance missions on Americans with no allegations that they've been involved in a crime. And that's really wild. And so many people, I think, probably have that same instinct, like, what in the hell happened to this country that we suddenly knew right after, days after January 6th, that everybody there was a domestic terrorist and a white supremacist? Where did that narrative come from? Who was crafting it? Who was pushing out those talking points? A lot of the leftist media was on board right away. And what we found out is that through FOIA requests and a lot of sort of investigation by this Air Marshals National Council, they got one of the original letters that was sent from Benny Thompson, who was the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. And he wrote a letter to the administrator of the TSA. So that administrator doesn't sound like it's a very prestigious title, but that's the top guy at TSA. His name is David Pekoski. And Pekoski got a letter that basically said the following: what are you doing to address these white supremacists and domestic terrorists that tried to take over our government and may try to come after and attack the inauguration of Joe Biden? And what are those steps that you're taking to inhibit their ability to get on an aircraft? And that's what he asked them. That, to me, when you're the oversight committee that has the the purse strings for a federal agency, you're essentially saying you've got 1 week to come up with a briefing telling me what your solution is to this problem. And we haven't seen that until just this week, which is pretty wild. The second piece of it is it was written 5 days after. It was written on January 11th. So this happened very, very quickly, that with no trials, with no completed investigations, he had already decided that they were white supremacists and that they were domestic terrorists. And many of these people were never charged with anything at all. Some of them have not been convicted and they are still pending. But it turns out that that's a real problem for me as someone who swore allegiance to the Constitution, and theoretically a congressman would have as well. We do have a Fifth Amendment right to due process. And in theory, we shouldn't be taking away your constitutional guaranteed right to travel. I did a whole piece on this for Uncover DC. Tracy Beans does a pretty good website over there. And they carried my piece, which basically said that since like 1870, the United States Supreme Court has confirmed that the right to travel is actually constitutional to be able to move between states. So if you're going to deprive somebody of that right without any due process, that should be a problem, one would think, and especially if you have a constitutional oath to protect the Bill of Rights.
What additional security screenings are these people going through? Are they being alerted that they're now on some special list? They're being watched, that over their shoulder there's a federal air marshal as they get up to go to the bathroom or ask for additional peanuts, that there's a federal air marshal there making sure that they are not a threat to national security?
Yeah, it's a kind of a yes and a no. If you're in the know, then you know what's going on. If you've experienced it, the people that have experienced it definitely know that something is amiss. When they print out their boarding pass, when you and I go jump on a flight, especially if you're going domestically in the U.S., you can usually check in 24 hours in advance. You go to United, you go to Southwest, whatever, and you say, yeah, click in and put me in the boarding group and I'm good to go. These people will find that there's an error in trying to check in. They're unable to do that. And they'll have to actually go to the flight desk. They'll have to go to the desk outside the secured area at any airport they want to travel in. And when they do, they're going to see wide eyes from the attendant who's standing behind the desk, because it's going to alert them that this person is on a terror watch list called Quiet Skies. Now, Quiet Skies people may be familiar with because it was a big expose that the Boston Globe did in 2018. And it was such a big blowback on the department, on the TSA, that they ended up putting out on their website. You can actually go find it right now. Just type in Quiet Skies TSA, and you'll see they have an official statement about what it is. And in theory, it's watching potential terrorists based on all these types of metrics they do, and the intel analysts crunch all the numbers, and they decide who the potential threats are that are international terrorists. But in reality, what it's become since January of 2021 is it's just a watch of American citizens that's no allegations of any violence or any danger. When they get flagged with this Quiet Skies program, they're going to see 4 S's prominently displayed in at least 2 places on their boarding pass. And that quad S delineator is their first tip that they're about to have a really rough experience, sometimes lasting hours. They're going to get aggressive and enhanced screening procedures. They're going to be physically touched, sometimes even strip searched. Every single item that they bring with them is going to be swabbed for potential bomb-making activity. They're going to swab every zipper of every bag, of every carry-on. They'll open every pouch, and they go through every single compartment, and they go through this incredibly aggressive theatrical display that has no benefit to the American people. Interestingly enough, I think the number that Sonia Labosco told me was something like $500 million has been spent on this program since they created it, and it's got 0 terrorists have been interdicted with it. So it's completely theatrical. It's classic TSA, right?
Right.
So the sad thing is these guys are going to go through that, or these guys and gals, they actually had a big break over, and this is why I'm mentioning Uncover again. Uncover DC did this piece. A woman named Wendy Mahoney wrote a story about the fact that an infant was placed on this terror watch list because the infant is the child of 2 people that are on the watch list. And so like an 8-month-old infant or 11-month-old infant being placed on there, it literally says infant on the boarding pass and then quad S's. People can see the photos over on the website. So this also should really outrage people because there's an opportunity cost. You've got a bunch of federal air marshals, highly trained for a specific mission set, and now they're babysitting a family with an infant. Anyone who's ever traveled with an infant kind of knows how difficult and tough that is to do. You're not looking to do terrorism. You're looking to make sure your baby doesn't make everybody on the plane miserable. And now they've got like hours and hours of missing flights. Oftentimes there's like sort of this process is the punishment type of thing. And it all comes apparently out of the Committee for Homeland Security, which is pretty awful to think.
Well, hopefully if they're going to spend all that time with the baby, they'd at least, change the diaper and take care of the baby for a while, because that's the biggest problem. It's unbelievable to me. And, most Americans have no idea that this is happening, and they are now the targets of this. America, patriotic Americans are now the target, the biggest threat to democracy internally. This is where we're now seeing our intelligence community. We've heard it from Secretary Mayorkas of Department of Homeland Security emphatically state on a 9/11 ceremony talking about the biggest threat to the United States is internal, a domestic white supremacist terrorism. Where have we seen this, though? Where is the evidence that the biggest threat to the United States, you worked at the FBI, is there a mountain of evidence showing that the greatest threat to the United States is from inside?
Not in my personal experience. And let me step us back and kind of say, how did we get here? Because I think that's really the story, is how did the FBI become an organization that is out there running after what we call statistical accomplishments and running numbers that are specifically geared on the threat that this Biden administration is interested in, the white supremacy threat. And they've, he's said it multiple times. He's made political enemies his biggest priority based on what he said. I'm just taking the guy's own words. I'm not a real political guy. I never really was. So this is kind of a weird story, but let's walk it back to see, how did this happen? And a friend of mine named George Hill, who's part of my little group of FBI whistleblowers, we've kind of banded together like on this lifeboat called the Suspendables so that we don't end up, getting squashed by this huge government agency that's, pretty dangerous and scary. And what we've done is we've done a bunch of interviews, and I've kind of gleaned a lot. He was a former intel guy. He was at the FBI for 12 years. He was a supervisory intel analyst. Before that, he was at the NSA for 5 years, and he spent 26 years also in the background working for Marine Corps. He was working for Marine Corps intelligence and then also for naval intelligence. So the guy's got a very serious resume. And I asked him a simple question, and sometimes when you get that, you don't get a good answer. His answer was outstanding, and it's worth your audience understanding. Before 9/11, the United States had a very clear name and mission set for what national security involved. It involved protecting our constitutionally guaranteed way of life, and it made sure that the Constitution maintained its, supremacy as the document that governed the United States, and nobody could take us over. That was the whole point. Now, people die in that mission, and they have. I know some, you may know some. People give their lives in order to serve that mission set for national security. And that was part of the goal. It was like, keep the fight away from the United States and protect this country. On basically September 12th of 2001, that mission changed dramatically. And we've seen that roll out over 20 years or so as it's metastasized to a very different mission. And that mission was as follows: no American will die at the hands of a terrorist on U.S. soil. That is the new definition of national security. And once you accept a zero-fail mission, no American dies from terrorists on U.S. soil, that's going to be tyranny at some point. We can look at the zero COVID stuff they did in China where they're welding people into their homes. Once you start saying that nobody can die from terrorism, you have to go through and you've justified all of the overreach that may happen on the federal government spectrum. And so how did that creep happen, I think, is also worth discussing. It starts off like this: if no American can die from terrorism, we need to keep an eye on the terrorists. That seems pretty reasonable. We don't really have a problem with that. So you're going to look for, where are the foreign terrorists? Where is Al-Qaeda? Eventually, where is ISIS? Where is Al-Shabaab? Where are these people? Where are these entities working? I mean, where are the FARC, right? In Latin America. Where are these groups working? And how do we keep them out of the United States? And how do we investigate them when they come here? That seems okay. We're kind of okay with that idea, I think. But you very quickly run out of international terrorists because, one, there's not that many of them. And two, once you found them, they're not going to come here in the same way. And so they ran out of what we would call the International Terrorism Mission. The FBI calls it ITOS, the International Terrorist Operations Section. They ran out of a mission in a big way. It's a very small chunk, but they had this huge funding mandate from Congress because everybody wanted to be on the right team stopping terrorism. And when they went on to the next thing, they said, well, where else can we find terrorism? We can find them in first generation or recently naturalized American citizens who live in the United States, but they ascribe to a foreign ideology. Now, this is going to be really common to people. It's called homegrown violent extremists. Not everybody has a good definition of it, but that's what it is. You're born in the United States or you're a naturalized citizen, but you ascribe to those ideologies. You're an Al-Qaeda guy. You've sworn allegiance to it, even though you're a first-generation Somali born in, you're born in Minneapolis, let's say. So maybe you pick on that thing. So now you've got this group of people called HVEs, and we're going to watch them, and we do all the surveillance on them, and we do the investigations on them, and we try to stop them from doing terrorism too. Okay, fair game. But once you start looking into your own house for terrorists and you run out of the international terrorists and you run out of the HVEs, you're going to keep trying to figure out how to use that funding because government agencies don't exist to get smaller. They're not interested in efficiency. They're interested in growing their empires and making sure they have more employees and getting a bigger budget. That's just how it works. So they started looking for a thing they called DVEs. We went from HVE to DVE. A DVE is a domestic violent extremist. And that is anybody, in the first cases, it was like people that were, putting spikes into logging trees and they were going out and doing like radical, fights against, whaling or something like that. They were also people that were white supremacists, that were Klansmen, that were looking to, firebomb a synagogue or something. So some of those things you can kind of justify. But as you try to spin up the threat and as you have more and more money that is tied up in terrorism that's not going to the places that it ought to go, you start looking for and making up this threat. And I believe, this is my personal experience, and I had 20 plus what we would call like deployments. They were 2 weeks at a time, hitting high priority FBI terrorism cases that basically, and I've said this multiple times now, that the demand for white supremacy is outstripping the supply of white supremacy, so we have to manufacture it. And the FBI has gone into this sort of game where they have a playbook. They started doing it on Muslims in the early 2000s. They've done it on HVEs, who are predominantly Muslim as well. And they're now doing it on people that are fitting the conservative bill, but they're just doing the same thing over and over again. And I always tell people, this is a great like sort of free tip for your audience. If you ever meet somebody, generally online, who agrees with all of your worst ideas, especially the ones that might be violent, even if they're just sort of said in hyperbole, and then they're not only willing to agree with you, but they also want to help you enact them, and they want to do it for the exact amount of money you happen to have, that's a Fed. That's not your friend. They're going to try to help you get into a terrorism plot, and that's a good way to find yourself in federal prison, probably for 20 to life. And this is exactly the playbook. Wow. What's sad is it's been written long form by a guy named Trevor Aronson, who's an author, and he's no right winger. I mean, he works for The Intercept, but he's a good reporter, and he's written an excellent book that was considered mandatory reading for my surveillance team when I was working counterterrorism. The book is called The Terror Factory, and it's essentially, he's got a 15-minute TED Talk, so people can save themselves the book if they don't want to buy it, but it's worth a read. They can also just listen to it, and he essentially lays out that plan. They find people that are low IQ or down on their luck, financially in bad situations, that have some rough ideas. They encourage the worst ideas. They introduce undercovers. They introduce feds that are, conscripted, whether they're like CHS, the confidential human informant side, or the actual credentialed federal agent. And then they talk them into doing something terroristic. It's literally the meme of the FBI agent wearing the hat, poking the Pepe the Frog, saying, do a terrorism. That's what we do.
They're creating.
And so they goad them into that. They're creating it, correct, because that has to meet that supply. And so when you create terrorism, you're basically ensuring that your budget's going to be good. So where's the white supremacy coming from? There's a great meme, and I'm a big fan of memes because I think they say so much with so little. But there's a guy wearing an FBI raid jacket. He's got his firearm drawn, and he's pointing down at a building. And it says, when the FBI finally realizes where all the terrorism is coming from, and he's pointing up, and the building is the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. And that's what it is. It's coming out of the counterterrorism division out to the field, and then people are doing these investigations. Basically, it's the self-licking ice cream cone, if you're familiar with that sort of metaphor. Why does the ice cream cone exist? Because there needs to be ice cream and there's a tongue, and they both sort of feed off each other.
I mean, it's like what happened in Michigan, right? I mean, this is literally what happened in Michigan. When you have a number of, was it 12 individuals and 10 of them were feds going after the governor? This is literally right out of that playbook. We love to manufacture this in order to keep it going and to light this fire. It's amazing. When you were at the FBI and you were running counterterrorism and you were in these surveillance ops and you were doing these things, when did you realize, whoa, this is a moment when I need to step back from this? And the moment that you decided to blow the whistle and you saw what the FBI was doing, what was that moment where you crossed the Rubicon?
So for most people, I think this kind of thing is always a gradual step. I didn't start doing one thing. I got into the FBI in 2016, and my first week at the FBI Academy, they call it the 1 week where they introduce you to being a federal employee. I immediately found out that the FBI was not what I thought it was going to be. It's not Criminal Minds, and it's not super elite, and it's not like the show Quantico where it's the hardest grad school and the toughest boot camp and all this stuff. It's actually really a gentle gentleman's course. And maybe that wasn't always the case, but it was certainly easy when I was there. And I had a background coming out of the military, and I thought it was going to be tough. I expected to get punched in the face on the first day. That didn't happen. I was sort of let down as we went through it. And so I kind of went into the FBI doing the 5 months of training at Quantico thinking, when is this going to get serious? When are we going to be doing serious things with serious people? And it didn't happen at the academy. That's just not the nature of the way it works. When I got assigned to the Washington field office, this was in late 2016 and going into 2017, I immediately found that I had a terrible supervisor who did an awful job. She was breaking federal employment law and some other things that just made no sense. So I started by reporting the small infractions that I saw. I also saw there's a big concept that people are talking about now as it faces renewal called FISA 702. It's a specific subset of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I was assigned to basically read FISA, particularly 702 FISA, for like 10 hours a day. Here's the catch. It was in Chinese. And I don't read or speak or write Chinese. I have no familiarity with that language whatsoever. They took me out of the military where I had a background as a airborne qualified, dive capable air traffic controller with a licensed paramedic skill set. And so I come from this sort of interesting, weird, like amorphous, hybrid special operations background where I'm training to go in and do rescues. It's a very direct action type mission. And they go, you know what'd be good for you? You're kind of an outdoor dog. You've slept on the ground. Like you've been to SEER school and done like interrogation stuff. What if we put you in an office where you sat for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, and just looked at Chinese FISA that you couldn't understand? And I thought, well, that's a really good way to get me to talk. Like you'll definitely break me that way.
Right.
So here I am sitting and looking at this, and you'd assume like, okay, well, you're assigned to that. You don't speak the language, whatever. At least there's a linguist there, right? And we didn't have a linguist. We had no linguist assigned to my squad. And the fun thing is they gave us a linguist eventually. She was an intel analyst who was a native speaker, which was great. And then I found out that she didn't read Chinese. She could only speak it. And everything I had was in writing. It was like looking at people's email addresses. So utterly useful. And the only thing that we did with that FISA, which was really scary to me, and this is one of the first kind of disclosures that I started making as I was calling out the problems I saw, was that we were doing what's called reverse targeting. Reverse targeting is specifically illegal under the FISA. You're not allowed to get a FISA on one person and use it to find somebody else. Let's say you had a foreign contact who happened to work for an intelligence agency, but you didn't know that. The FBI might get that FISA, the 702 coverage. They're a non-US based person working for a foreign intel service. We could get a 702 FISA. I could write it up in the morning. And we would have that. We would start collecting using the NSA databases, and we'd find out what that person was doing. But if I was finding that person specifically looking for Americans that foreign intel person was contacting, then I would be targeting the Americans. That's called reverse targeting, and that's illegal. But it's one of the only ways that 702 FISA is most useful. Because if you're a criminal investigator and you're looking for criminal acts and you're trying to find people that are, damaging United States security, you don't really care what foreign spies are doing to foreign people. You care what they're doing with the US people and how those people might be compromising the United States national security mission. So you're only going to use that tool illegally. I use it as kind of an example. Imagine if you're a TSA officer, since we brought him up earlier, and you're sending people through a metal detector and your job is keeping guns off aircraft. And then you're told your job depends on you keeping the gun off the aircraft, but you're not allowed to use the metal detector. By the way, everyone has to go through the metal detector, but don't use that to find guns. You have to find it another way. You're going to find guns with the metal detector because that's what the tool does. Right. And that's the way 702 FISA basically works. So I started having a problem with that right away. I also didn't understand the mission set because we weren't looking for criminal acts.
So you were using it to target Americans by going around to use national security tools, essentially, tools that are illegal in a way, right? These are illegal tools then to build a criminal case against Americans because you're targeting under the rule, right? It's international. So then you're building a criminal case against an American using illegal tools. Am I right about that? Am I seeing this the way that they were putting these together?
There's two pieces to it. Part number one is it's not necessarily a criminal case, which was the biggest problem I had. It's like, what are we doing? Why are we looking into these people? And I went to my boss and I went to my boss's boss and I said, why are we looking at these people? Are we looking to find a crime? And they said, no. And I said, well, what are we looking for? And they said, we're looking for information. And I said, got it. Okay. And what is that information in aid of? And they said, well, then we'll know more things. And I said, no. That's not what the information is for. That's just what happens when you have more information. What do we do with the information? And they said, we'll use it to get more information. And so that's when I first started realizing the way the FBI actually works. It's got two different halves. Most people are familiar with the criminal investigation sort of modality, if you will. The FBI, as a criminal enterprise, as a criminal law enforcement entity, does linear investigations. You can imagine this pretty easily. Someone commits a crime, right? We got to find out who did it, why did they do it, how did they do it, all the evidence. We bring it in front of the United States attorney. They decide to either prosecute or not. If we prosecute, we bring them in for a plea deal. They plea or not. And then we may take it to court. And then a jury or a judge is going to decide what happens. And then that's pretty much it. There may be some appeals, but essentially that's the job. It's linear. At the end of it, someone either ends up in prison or doesn't. And that's criminal investigations. Pretty straightforward. But if you start looking at what intelligence investigations are, this is going to be counterterrorism and counterintelligence. What their job is to find information on a target. Who does that target talk to? What do they do? What do they know? Who do they interact with? All these kind of things. What do their bank accounts look like? Okay, now you found out who some of their friends are. Now we can spin off a news circle on that person. We can spin off a news circle on that person. They're all circular, and they are not going towards a specific goal because like any other circle, it starts and then it never has to end. And they literally do this for years. The first 10 or so cases that I was assigned when I got to the Washington field office were absolute garbage. There's no other way to say it, and I can't even say it nicely, but they were trash. They were obviously BS right up front to me. And I said, let me just go interview this guy. I can tell you exactly what's going on. I've read every serial in the case file. There are hundreds of updates to this case. And at the end of it, after reading all of them, I know exactly what's happening. This guy was lazy when he filled out his background check form. And they said,
Right.
no, if you go talk to him, then he'll know. And I go, yeah, well, then we can close the case though. And they're like, well, you're not trying to close the case. You need to have 8 cases open for your file review. And so this is that you're doing things in order simply to exist. It's like why there's a concept, I think in Oregon they do it. They definitely do it in New Jersey, that there's somebody that pumps gas for you. You can't, it's all served by an attendant, right?
Right.
And I remember asking a guy one time when I was driving up on the East Coast, I said, well, why do you pump the gas when I can pump the gas? And he said, people need jobs.
Right.
And this is essentially why the intelligence apparatus functions the way it does. Is it leading towards a mission set or a goal that's going to do something kinetic? No, it's not. It's simply, we need to have a job to be able to look at things. And then the scary thing is, should they uncover some criminality, then they know that forever. They're always going to know it's in an FBI file. And then they can build a criminal case in what's called parallel construction. And your audience may be familiar with that. The idea is that I've gleaned some information about you using national security tools that I cannot use for a criminal investigation. They're not admissible in court, but I know that stuff is there. So now I can go write a search warrant and get them in a lawful way for criminal prosecution because I found them in a different way. I found them using the kind of things that Snowden was kind of warning about. I found them using things called like national security letters, which is a subpoena that is secret that the FBI field office signs off on. I found out all your bank records. I saw some weird, let's say I was looking at you for Chinese counterintelligence. I thought maybe you were working with the Chinese, but I find out that you got a bunch of money coming in and you're actually doing mortgage fraud. I now have that information and I know it. And should it be a big enough deal, I could go investigate it and I could parallel construct that criminal case to be able to prosecute you for something that had nothing to do with what I was looking at. I just know it now and I'm not going to unknow it.
Help me understand this though, not being a lawyer. If the big piece of this is inadmissible and you discover this and it's inadmissible, how are you able to make that leap to get a warrant to investigate mortgage fraud? How would a judge sign off on a warrant to go, or whoever would sign off on a warrant to allow them to go do that investigation?
There's 2 pieces. Number one is that judges are very lenient about FBI writing affidavits. If anybody's been following the January 6th stuff, like many of them are totally illogical, and they'll sign off on it anyway because it's the FBI. What the FBI wouldn't lie to us. So they don't even often read the affidavit. If you go and put your name to it, it'll oftentimes be signed off on. That's part one. They're given a lot of credibility just by being the agency. But the second piece of it, which may be more sort of difficult for people to handle, when you have tools that can go in, let's say I can use X-ray vision and I can look inside what's in your safe. And I see that you have an unlicensed machine gun in your safe. I'm not allowed to do that. That's a violation of your Fourth Amendment right? I need to have a search warrant to go looking through there. But I'm using this technology and I find out that you've got a machine gun in that safe. So now I've identified you as a machine gun owner that needs to be prosecuted. I can go and find people that know you. And I can find a source that can corroborate. Oh yeah, you know what? I've heard him talk about he's got a secret gun in his safe. I found this. You can build that probable cause in parallel construction. You already know what you're trying to find because you know it's there. It's much easier to find something once you know it already exists. So I can go find other ways to source that information, whether it be a human source, whether it be other financial records. I could write a subpoena in a different case. I could open an allegation. I can find someone that makes an allegation against you. I can allege that you did it. And we open up that criminal case and it moves in parallel to the national security. I already know it's there. I know I'm going to find it. And so even if I have like a kind of a shadier written search warrant, if I have weaker probable cause and the judge gives me the benefit of the doubt because I'm in the FBI, they're going to be validated because I'm going to find the thing that I think I'm going to find because I already know it's there. And that's where it gets really dangerous. The judge is not looking bad. They have no egg on their face. They're like, yeah, you wrote a search warrant. It might've been a little bit thin, but sure enough, there it is. There's that machine gun. It was in the safe, just like you said. And that to me is the biggest danger of a weaponized federal agency that has law enforcement abilities, right?
Right.
But it also has intelligence capabilities. In all of human history, that would be referred to as a secret police. If you have extrajudicial abilities to do searches, but you also have the ability to lock somebody up with a badge and a gun and the sort of nominal legitimacy of the state, you are a secret police. And it's happened in every single tyranny that's ever existed. They've always had them.
Right, exactly. Just look at Portugal and a revolution in 1974 and the secret police. This was,
that's right.
It's at the heart of all of them. It's using these tools to go and search, and it is tyranny to search your own citizenry in this way. When you brought this to the FBI, when you brought this to your superiors and you blew the whistle on us, you brought this to members of Congress. What did they say? What do they do? Is this still in place today?
Oh yeah, it's definitely still in place. That's number one. But my that was kind of my first inkling that there was something going wrong. And basically the answer is am I going to be able to fix this as one guy, as a GS-11, which is the lowest rank? I'm just getting out of probation. Nobody cares what you have to say. They just move you somewhere else. So I said, is there a way I can not be part of this? Like I have an ethical problem with this. I'm going to be complaining about it, but when you're a guy who's lived in the military, when you understand sort of a hierarchical view of things, you go through the chain of command. If the chain of command doesn't do something, it's not like it's obvious to you that you're going to go to a member of Congress. That never occurred to me at that time, to be honest with you. And so I was like, just get me out of here. I don't want to do this. I don't want to participate. I don't want to be part of this operation. And I got myself assigned to this counterterrorism in they're a surveillance team, and they're not prestigious in any way. I don't want to let people think it is. They call themselves the Special Operations Group, and it should be called the Special Observations Group. We basically watched criminal subjects because we were armed and they were potentially armed, and we would do MS-13 surveillance. We would do white collar fraud, but we had a specific amount of money and mandate that said if there was a priority counterterrorism case, then we would go to those. And we shipped all over the country. Like I said, I saw white supremacists or alleged white supremacists. People who are racist are actually allowed to be like that in the U.S., it turns out. But we would go and investigate them, and we would go and watch them and see who they met with and took pictures of them and got license plates and patterned out their movements and so on and helped build the case. So I did that for 3 years. And some of the stuff, even though you kind of go, well, these are BS cases, we were doing them in an ethical way, which I felt okay about. And the second thing is that you don't have any sort of, you don't have any expectation of privacy about where you drive. Anybody could follow you if they can follow you. And we did. We didn't use any secret methods. It was like me with my eyeballs, a set of binoculars, and a car and a radio with the team. And so we would follow people around that were potentially a threat. We would try to suss out whether they were or not. Oftentimes that would be actually exculpatory, which is not a bad thing for Americans in general. So I did that for a little while, but that gets old. Sitting in a car for 8 hours a day and peeing in a bottle is like, there's a shelf life of that. And I sort of went to the edge of it. And
it's my college road trips coming back from University of Pittsburgh. I know all about it.
That's exactly right. I told people, I said, I used to sneak my my pee bottle actually onto the list of like all the expensive gear that the executives would buy for us. They'd have me do these dog and pony shows. So I'd go into this hangar and we'd have a big table and I'd lay out like night vision and here's these specialized cameras and here's all this stuff. And I'd put it all out there, weapons and body armor. And I would always leave like an empty bottle of lemonade from Simply Lemonade because it's got a really good cap on it. That's really important.
Right. Oh, I know. Yeah.
It's big.
Yeah, it's big.
you gotta have a certain size mouth. You gotta have a good cap, and you gotta be able to grab it with gloves on. That's really, if it falls over, you don't want it to spill in the car. These are like the critical things.
Well, you know what I love? I love that the FBI would pay, that you would expense report that the FBI was paying for that. I'm actually totally fine with that. But the money spending on surveilling Americans and doing all of these nefarious things, I'm not. But your pee bottle, I'm okay with.
Yeah, well, I paid for the pee bottle out of my pocket. That's the sick irony of all of it, right? That's my own money. I would just sneak it onto there because I would always tell them, I said, you can do surveillance with basically, you need a couple of items. You need a human being, you need a cup of coffee, and you need a pee bottle. Everything else is negotiable. Radio, binoculars, cameras, all that stuff can be done. But as long as you get the pee bottle and the cup of coffee, you can stay awake and you can pee in a bottle. You can be there all day. So I used to do that. Like I said, shelf life, that's if you do that sometimes 16 days in a row, and I did, I would fly to somewhere and literally work 14 to 16 days in a row. I did it in Portland in an undercover or what they call low visibility surveillance role for the Antifa stuff. We did it all over DC. I've done it in Pensacola. I've done it in Alaska. I've been out to New Mexico. I've been all over the United States doing this kind of mission. And some of them are good and some of them are complete BS. It just turns out that's what they are. After the shelf life kind of expired, I was like, I need to get out of DC. I need to get away from all this nonsense. And I took a voluntary transfer to Las Cruces, New Mexico, which many people don't know is in the United States. It actually is. New Mexico is an American state. I found people going like, oh, is that extraterritorial? It's like, right. Do you not have a map? No, it's not.
When I lived in West Virginia, people were flying into New York. They were surprised that West Virginia is actually a state. They thought it was Western Virginia. So yeah, New Mexico is a state. Yeah, that's right.
It turns out, and Las Cruces, even though it sounds like it might be in Mexico, is not. It's actually in the United States. So I lived there and I worked in this little thing and I got an opportunity to do something that nobody wants to do in the Bureau, or most people don't, which was work on Indian reservations and do major crime investigations into sexual assaults and murders and death investigations and so on. And that's not a very prestigious role. You could see, I'm the guy that was like seeking the bottom. I want to find whatever the least interesting thing is to the headquarters units so I could just be left alone and do something that I thought was morally righteous, which it was. But while I'm there, I end up getting an email, which is what set me on this path of not having an FBI job anymore. And the email was sent to me by one of the supervisors in the office who clearly had a problem with it, but didn't say anything to anybody publicly. And it said that the FBI was going to be looking into parents that were at school board meetings and protesting. Now, the fun thing about this particular whistleblower disclosure, which went public in November of 2021, Jim Jordan famously made it public to people that the FBI was doing this thing. It was called the EDU officials threat tag. The idea was, a lot of people think that the whistleblowing activity was saying that the FBI was abusing its powers and going after parents at school boards. That's actually not the case. There actually is a purview for the FBI, although stupid, and we would probably disagree with the resources. You actually can investigate a parent who's involved at a school board making what are called interstate threats. That's a violation of federal law. It's a dumb one. It doesn't rise to the level of FBI interactions, but you could justify it. And we often did if they were considered a quote unquote threat to life. What I said was the Attorney General of the United States had told Congress under sworn testimony that he would not be using counterterrorism resources in order to investigate parents at school board meetings. And the email was directly from the assistant director of the counterterrorism division. And that to me was the major problem. The problem was it looked like the Attorney General had perjured himself about the use of resources. We talk about, criminal versus national security. Using national security resources to go after basically a low-level felony interstate threat case is not a good thing to do. And so that made it political in my mind. But more importantly, it made it look like he had committed perjury. So I went to my member of Congress in the 2nd District of New Mexico, and I said, this is a problem. And by the way, this is a thing about FISA that I've reported up my chain of command that's never been addressed. So here's 702 problems. And by the way, here's a couple of other weird things that are going on. And I made a host of whistleblower disclosures that lasted for over 2 hours, and they took 4 pages of notes, front and back. They just sat there and wrote down notes after, you can tell I can talk. So I did. And I just gave them everything that looked like a problem. I said, look, these are problems, and we need to deal with it. And interestingly enough, not 4 weeks earlier, we had also gotten word that there was going to be a federal mandate in order to require all federal employees to take the COVID vaccines. And I didn't want to do that. I had a very specific religious problem with it. I'm a pro-life Catholic. I've been raised in the Catholic Church, and my wife and I got more and more religious as this went on. And so as that came up, I was like, look, I have a legitimate objection under Title VII, a sincerely held belief that these were developed in a way using fetal cell lines that is antithetical to my belief system. And so I swore out an affidavit like you're allowed to do, and I gave it to the Human Resources Department, and I said, I'm requesting a religious exemption. They don't have to accommodate your religion, but they have to at least entertain it. And then they can decide whether or not it burdens the government. The government never evaluated my religious accommodation request. 4 weeks later, I'm in my congressman's office, or congresswoman's office, actually, and giving this disclosure. And then a couple days after that, I was told that I could no longer come back into the office unless I took a COVID test every 72 hours. And now at this point, I've been a paramedic for over a decade. I have a top secret clearance, and I have 280 hours of sick leave. I'm very, very capable of staying at home with a box of Kleenex in the middle of the so-called pandemic that was going on. Like, just let me stay home. Right. I should be able to figure that out, or take my security clearance. And that's what they actually opted to do. They kicked me out of the office for about from November 23rd of 21 until March 4th of 22. They brought me back for 6 weeks. They took me from the lowest priority Indian reservation case. They assigned me, considered me a national security threat, and put me on the national security squad. And then they put me in a corner and assigned me no work for 6 weeks, and then took my badge and my gun. And in the interim, I found out that the chief legal division guy in the Albuquerque office called headquarters, and no way that he would have known this, but I found out about this call. And he said, I got a guy who's refusing the COVID vaccine, and he's a whistleblower. What should we do with him? They reached out to a friend of mine who they had no way of knowing was a friend of mine. There was no connection to us whatsoever. It just was a happenstance connection that we were connected. And he called me up and he said that they just asked about you. And I said, well, what did you say? He said, I said they should promote you, which we both laughed about. And then they came down and took my badge and my gun. And that happened in April of 2022. In September of 22, I decided that since my badge, my gun, my authorities, my paycheck were gone, I was going to sell my house, which we did. And I left the closing table. And I drove to the airport. My wife drove off. We had no home. She drove off to go stay with my parents, which we did for 6 months. And I flew to Miami. I took a car up and I sat down with Dan Bongino, who many people will know. And I did an interview with Dan Bongino that basically launched me into a public spectrum where I was going to be talking about FBI malfeasance. And because of that, and because of those decisions, we also ended up exposing a whole bunch of other stuff, like the fact that they were targeting Catholics, they were targeting veterans and people who have, Betsy Ross flags or Gadsden flags, that they were targeting people for mis and disinformation under claiming it was an election violation, election law violation. So I started exposing a whole bunch of stuff, and I've started working in the journalistic space because of that. Basically like an unpaid government transparency sort of activist, if you will, which is kind of a funny thing to find yourself doing, but knowing that the FBI would never take me back after that happened. So now that you're on the other side of this, what kind of a response have you gotten from other FBI agents? We've seen a number of whistleblowers coming forward to, you've banded together with these suspendables, right? To come together and blow the whistle and to make us aware of what's going on inside the FBI. But have you heard now from a lot of other FBI agents saying this place is corrupt
and trying to get information out about it, or have you gotten a lot of blowback? Have they really tried to come after you?
It's kind of a mixed bag. I think, interestingly enough, we had them come after us. The inspection division came after us, which is the internal affairs unit that investigates internally. They call it the Office of Professional Responsibility and the IA, the Internal Affairs Intake Unit. And the two of them investigated me and my friend Steve Friend and my buddy Garrett O'Boyle, and they threw them all out on their face as well. But we found out they were actually trying to pursue these sort of BS charges. They have additional authorities if you're actually an FBI employee. So in April of this year, I actually had to resign from a job that I hadn't been paid for a year because they considered me an employee and were using that as a special privilege to investigate me under these made up things. They claimed it was a misdemeanor violation of federal law for me to have a picture of the FBI symbol on a wrecking ball that was hitting a brick wall of the American flag. That was on my podcast. And they said that I was using their symbol in a way that violated federal law. I mean, if you can just imagine how absurd that is. The
So
free
come up
speech
with something.
ramifications there.
Yeah, because they love to
and
like
that's
just
what they
drum
did.
up anything. They're like, guys, we got to find something. Can you, his podcast art, let's go after that.
That's, I mean, imagine FBI agents spending their time. That's what they probably all signed up to do. They really wanted to go out. But the
Right.
number one rule in the FBI is you got to protect the FBI. And the number one sin is that you've, sort of defamed the FBI. So I committed that sin, no doubt about it. And as I said, like the first week I was at the FBI Academy, I kind of thought like, how am I going to do 20 years in this job? My buddy and I still have this conversation. He's still an agent. But the blowback has been a lot of people tuck and run. They do the turtle routine where they say, my paycheck and my pension are on the line. I've got to hide and I've got to keep my head down and maybe I can make it to retirement. So a lot of people did that, including my boss in New Mexico, who I thought was a good guy. He literally told me, I agree with the stance you're taking. I don't think you should have to test for COVID every 72 hours. But I retire in 2.5 years and I've got a mortgage and I've got an alimony that I got to pay to an ex-wife. So I can't take a stand with you. So you're out of luck. So when people tell you to your face, I appreciate the honesty, to be honest with you. I don't disrespect that. That was his position. I sort of feel pity for someone that says my honor or my integrity is worth $150,000, $160,000 a year. That's sad, especially if you're in your late 40s and you've lived most of your life and you kind of have already gotten to this point and that's what you're worth. But the other option was that people started coming to us. And we developed a group of people that are kind of in that suspendable category. And we're doing something that nobody, I think, has ever done before, which is that on accident, I created a network of people that were like-minded that wanted to expose malfeasance because none of us wanted to take that COVID vaccine. We all had the same exact things involved. We were all pro-life Christians. That was the unifying thing. And everybody that got together, we had hundreds of them come together in an encrypted app where we spoke back and forth. We shared what the policies were that were completely illogical. In one office, they were doing it one way. In another office, they were doing it another way. In one place, I would have to wear a mask. In another, I could come in and I never had to test. And it was based on office to office piecemeal enforcement. So we shared that. And we started doing that. They were also able to find all these violations of policy. And so what we've been exposing has not been classified information, a real insider threat issue. Nobody there is a traitor or a terrorist to the U.S. government. What they're doing is they're showing that they are not keeping their own word, that they're violating their own federal policies in unclassified ways, even though they violate policy to expose it. And they're using me and my buddy Steve Friend and my friend Garrett O'Boyle and George Hill, as I referenced earlier, as sort of conduits to be able to get these to members of Congress. Because we've got a pipeline directly to people like Jim Jordan and Chuck Grassley and so on. And they don't have to expose themselves by coming through us. We put them in touch. It's like, here's an encrypted email. You guys go through, you send it off to Congress. If they need to talk to somebody or get a statement, we're happy to do it. And it keeps their heads down. So we're kind of working an intelligence operation, if you will, against the FBI in some ways, but for the good of the people, which is to say, like, we just want to expose malfeasance. It's not partisan. It has nothing to do with who's in power. Right. Because this stuff was going on under Donald Trump. It's obviously going on under Biden. It definitely happened under Obama. And it's slowly been getting that way because the FBI serves the FBI, not any particular political master. It just turns out that the political left kind of has the reins right now.
So there is a deep state, right? There is an unelected permanent government that's controlling things. And whether it's at the CIA or the FBI, there is a deep state, is there not?
There is. I think deep state is one of those sexy terms that people kind of get the wrong idea about. If you imagine just the words, when people think about it, capital D, capital S, deep state, they're imagining more like the Cancer Man from the X-Files. You remember?
The X-Files.
They were all in the dark room.
Man. Yeah, like just you don't know
so
who
he's
he
sitting
is.
there, the Marlboro guy.
We don't know his name.
Yes,
he's
right.
just there smoking, pulling the strings, right?
That's right. The Cancer Man in the overcoat, and he's in a room full of other guys in overcoats, and they're all old white guys that have nefarious ideas. They're like what people think Klaus Schwab probably does from the World Economic Forum. They're just, they're Bond villains hanging out in a dark office, making, dark proclamations to lead the federal government. And I don't think that's really what goes on, although there probably are some of those figures. We just are not going to know what they are. The deep state is really the administrative state. and that is the state of administration. It's deep in so much as the bench is deep, in the way that you might have 3 starting pitchers. It's a deep roster of people that are willing to do the same thing. It's the reason why a guy like James Baker, who people found out was in the Twitter files and was shielding the DOJ from the inquiries that were going on during, Taibbi and Schellenberger's sort of inquest into the Twitter files. Well, James Baker is a deep state guy. He started with the DOJ in the early 90s, and he spent 30 years of his life working for that organization. He doesn't need to be given orders to protect the DOJ. It's his entire reputation. It's all he knows. All of his friends work there. He spent his whole life there, 30 straight years working for a group of people, and they all have the same kind of ideas. The deep state is unelected bureaucrats, and a bureaucrat is somebody that has advanced through the levels of federal employment. Many of them reach what's called the senior executive service. That's off the government scale. People are familiar with sort of the GS pay scale. It's called the general scale, where you are a GS1 through a GS15. I was a GS13 when I left. So I was at the top of the government pay scale, but I was a frontline FBI agent. The first line supervisors are GS14. The second line, the assistant special agents in charge, are GS15. Then you get to the guys who run the field offices and run the headquarters units. And they're called SES, Senior Executive Service. That is your deep state, because those people have already got 20 years of government service. And what they know is whatever they do, they can't be removed, not in an easy way. And number 2, they're going to outlast any president or any executive or any administrator that's politically appointed. They're the ones that run things. And the DOJ, people like Lee Loftus and Lisa Monaco are kind of the deep state operators. They're the AG's assistants. They're the assistant AG, I think it's what they're called, whatever, or the deputy AG. But they're the number 2 behind Merrick Garland. They're the ones making the real decisions. At the FBI, it's Paul Abate right now. Those people have outlasted everybody around them. They are the longest running, and they think they know what the right answer is because they've been doing it a long time. And of course, they know more than some newly elected guy or some political appointee who just came in. I mean, that's just how it works. That's what a deep state is.
Yeah, it's the permanent government. It's you're here for 4 years you run for a campaign. 3 of those years are spent raising money, and then you're gone. And we're here. We're going to be in Washington for the long haul. We're Dr. Fauci. We're going to be here, and we're going to be here for another decade, 2 decades while you're gone running the show. It's incredibly disheartening to hear this. And we're talking to you on a time when we're hearing about the CIA secret program on UFO reconnaissance and crash retrieval. They've been running that secret program. We know that members of Congress are trying to torpedo different disclosure acts, trying to keep things quiet, trying to hide all of this stuff. Are there any members of Congress, you mentioned Jim Jordan, you mentioned Chuck Grassley, who are trying to bring greater transparency to the FBI, where we can get rid of this corruption, where we can have sort of an expulsion of this, get rid of these FISA, these needless FISA warrants that are being used to target Americans? What can be done? What are you hearing from members of Congress as you bring this to them?
It's kind of interesting how little I've heard from Congress. Now, I've got a conduit. They're mostly staffers. The only person that I can speak pretty strongly about, Dan Bishop, was in the hearings that my buddies went and did. They did sworn affidavits, and they did sort of deposition style testimony in a congressional building. And Matt Gaetz was there as well. And beyond that, I mean, even the Jim Jordan office has been pretty weak. I've got a staffer who's medium level. She's sometimes in the hearings. I see her face, but she responds with, thanks for letting us know. We don't get it's not a two-way dialogue. It's a lot like probably the feds deal with a lot of local law enforcement where, information only goes one direction. We're giving them information. We're giving a lot of information. We're sending them kill shots on these things in ways that you should be able to do an impeachment of a Chris Wray. You should have been able to do an impeachment of a Merrick Garland if you were so interested. And the evidence is pretty overwhelming, but they're not using it well. And then, of course, you've also got this sort of deep state mentality where they are not responding to requests for information, to subpoenas, to FOIAs. They're hiding this kind of stuff. And so as they do that, they're obfuscating the sort of the oversight that they're supposed to have. And I just found out, and we kind of put this out a little bit on my Twitter page, but there was a meeting held at the FBI headquarters by the Office of General Counsel, an all hands meeting, which we have, we've got penetration of every office. When I say penetration, I mean that like an intelligence way. Like we have people that are reporting malfeasance, non-classified information about what's going wrong. And this was an unclassified briefing that basically had all of the senior heads of the Office of General Counsel for the FBI gathered to do a breakdown on every single investigation into the FBI by Congress. They were doing Oppo research on Congress investigations, and they were incredibly disparaging of it to the point where even the leftists that were sitting in there, and I've seen the handbill, I've seen the agenda of who was going to be giving each speech. There's like 6 different people or 5 different people from OGC that are giving these talks on each one of the individual investigations into the FBI by Congress. And the FBI was disparaging them, these members were, and they were saying such ridiculous things that the members who are even politically left-leaning inside the headquarters building, which is the majority of them, they said, obviously, no adults reviewed this presentation before it went out. Now, that thing is unclassified, and I've suggested to members of Congress that they get access to it because they should be able to subpoena that. It was videotaped, it was transcribed, and it was made available to everybody as a training material. There's no reason why they should be able to keep it. But I guarantee you the FBI will not be forthcoming because it'll be totally damning. And this is the kind of mindset where you think this is what a deep state is. They think they are above any oversight. They think they are above reproach by these entities. And so far, I can't really say they're wrong because we're not seeing any sort of action being taken that's tangible. You're not seeing people hauled out in front and thrown out in cuffs for not answering questions. You're just seeing disdain and disgust on the on these sort of administrators' faces.
Right. I mean, we played the tears, and I think we were in tears here on our show, seeing the story of Garrett O'Boyle and having his family, kicked out of their house, basically not being able to get any children's clothing when the FBI basically said, sorry, we're moving you across the country and you have no clothing, no place to live. And the same thing, of course, basically happening to you as well. And we thought we'd see a lot of movement on that. And we did, you think. And I can only hope these members of Congress are paying attention. I know we have members of Congress who watch this show, and hopefully they watch your show. Hopefully they'll be brave and take action on this through the holidays and maybe into this next calendar year to really do something about it. I would love I would love to see a subpoena of the FBI. Can you please show us the meeting minutes from when you spent your afternoon holding a meeting about Congress and the investigations into you? So how do you respond? How do you respond to these investigations? Like, that's a good use of the American taxpayer time, to have a meeting about the investigations into the FBI. It's unbelievable to me.
And kind of interestingly enough, too, that some of this stuff is starting to come out. We're getting validated in real time. We're getting vindicated. A lot of people do a whistleblower activity. They find out way after the fact, things get declassified and so on. We're not dealing in the classified space here. The things we're alleging are all policy violations, and they're mismanagement of federal resources that are pretty easy to actually uncover. So interestingly enough, one of the things that put my name on people's radar is that I exposed a document about how the FBI was investigating Catholics within the Richmond field office. And I had a whistleblower come to me and say, this is a real problem. This is a violation of the First Amendment, that the FBI needs to remain agnostic about religion altogether. And they are now investigating Latin Mass Catholics and saying they might have, fertile breeding grounds for white supremacy, which is absurd. So this is a big deal. I wrote a piece on it, exposed it. It went big time. It put me on Tucker Carlson and a bunch of other places, and I ended up talking to a lot of people about it. That's why a lot of people know what my name is, and they think that was the original thing I did. That was probably 7 in line of the allegations that I brought forward against the FBI, but it was obviously the biggest one because it affects 70 million Catholics in the U.S. And when that went kind of out, what we did is I started working with a group called Catholic Vote, which is a nonprofit advocacy group that basically advocates faith, family, freedom, these kind of deals. And what Catholic Vote did is they paired up with Judicial Watch, and they said, can we FOIA this stuff? Can we find out what they did? Because the question was always this: the FBI director said this was appalling. This was totally out of character for the FBI. This was not the way that we do things. We do things the right way for the right reasons. And so, okay, fine. So they FOIA'd all the conversation that went on in the back end. This was through the intelligence division. It was through the Office of General Counsel. It was through the Office of the Director, which is Chris Wray's office, and the people below him, and all these people. In fact, the chief counsel and their chief of staff was all involved in all these emails. Very, very high level, including the person who was in charge of the National Security Branch, which was a woman named Larissa Knapp, who's trash, but that's another story altogether. She's the one that gave hugs to all the people that knelt down for BLM, if it just kind of helps your viewers kind of get a sense of who she is. So she's the one she's executive director level. These are 7th floor Hoover level people. And what's interesting is nowhere in any of the FOIA documents, we got hundreds of pages of emails back, did it say someone is losing their job over this? How are we going to correct this? What kind of training are we going to push out to make sure this doesn't happen again? None of that ever happened. What we saw is a rush to cover the buttocks of the FBI. How do we stop the exposure? How are we going to address this? What talking points are we going to push out to spin this? Who's aware of it? What journalists are coming at us? Do we have any friendlies that we can get this story to? How do we put our messaging out there to turn this thing? Because it looks really bad. And one of the great lines was, it's pretty terrible, and it's even worse when it's self-inflicted. That was by a deputy assistant director. So when these things happen, they don't look and say, man, Are we the bad guys? You know, that classic, are we the baddies? There's none of that self-reflection that goes on in this agency. It's 100%, we're the right people. We're, the FBI. God forbid you ever disagree with anything we do. And if you think that we're the problem, then you're the problem. And that's why whistleblowers get crushed. That's why Garrett O'Boyle got crushed. He simply fulfilled his oath. I mean, and Garrett is one of my favorite people in the world. I talk to him every single day. Sometimes we have, tears. Sometimes we have laughs. Sometimes we have violent thoughts about how aggressive all this stuff has been. The reason he was so brave is because Garrett had already seen me removed. He already knew what happened to me. And he continued to dig into the story that I started with, which was that the parents were being investigated at school boards. Then the FBI came out and said, no, we don't do that. We would never investigate parents at school board meetings. So he pulled all the investigations from that threat tag and gave them to Jim Jordan's office and said, here's the 24 different investigations, and here's the names of the people being investigated. This is what they are lying about. That is an abject false statement. And they have the facts on it. They were being investigated simply because somebody alleged on a tip line that this was happening, that some guy owned guns and he was being rowdy at a school board meeting. That's not a federal crime. And they were going after them for political targeting. And Garrett exposed that, knowing full well that I'd already lost my paycheck, knowing full well that I'd lost my job. And he walked into that voluntarily, did the right thing, and then was left, as you said, homeless in between two duty posts. We actually had a whistleblower come forward very recently that shared this, and this is pretty wild. Not only did they remove him, it's actually against FBI policy to transfer somebody who's under an administrative inquiry. You can't take another job at another field office if you are under investigation. They leave you there because they might get rid of you. That's the reason. And what they did is they bypassed that. They broke FBI policy. They allowed him to sell his home to transfer it. By the way, he's unreimbursed for like $40,000 worth of hard costs for putting his family up in temporary lodging, for storage, for moving over. We paid $12,000 to rent trucks and go get his stuff in Virginia and move his things back to Wisconsin, where he ended up landing with family. So we paid out of pocket, and the FBI didn't pay him for any of the things that they were on the hook for, simply because they lured him out of his home, knowing that he had a 2-week-old baby, and they were going to leave him homeless. And there's some really colorful language involved in this, but the people that were doing it, that were doing that investigation, actually said, yeah, we're going to F him. On purpose, knowing that he didn't do the thing that they alleged he did. They alleged that he went to the media, and they knew that he didn't do it. And interestingly enough, Jennifer Moore, who was one of my favorite former bosses, the woman who removed all of our security clearances, the entire Suspendables lot, lost their security clearances because of Jennifer Moore's pen stroke. She also testified under oath in front of Congress that they did know that Garrett O'Boyle had done the thing they said, whereas her underlings have now come out, and we have whistleblower testimony saying that they actually knew that they didn't. So she probably perjured herself in front of Congress. She got a cushy job. You want to talk about the deep state and the way that it works. She got a cushy job working as a CSO, a chief security officer at General Electric Aviation, a defense contractor, even though she's probably one of the least capable human beings you've ever met.
We got to throw these people out. We've got
they need to be thrown in jail. If they're not, if some people aren't hanging, we're going to be sad about it. But
well, Kyle, it's been amazing getting to know you. I'd love to have you back here on the show. Like I said at the beginning, you're a true patriot and very, very brave for what you've done and continuing to shine a light on this seedy underbelly of both the FBI and the rest of the deep state, the permanent government. I really appreciate it. And where can people find your show, and if they want to connect with you and let people know that hey, you saw Kyle on Redacted and would love to follow you?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience and sharing this message far and wide. I just feel like it's one of those things. I'm doing it like a mission from God at this point, which is kind of like the Blues Brothers, kind of fun. They can find me at kyleseraphin.com if they want to go find an audio copy of the podcast, but it's on Apple and Spotify and all the places you'd find that. The video is on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. And then pretty much everywhere, I just use Kyle Seraphin. I have a handle on Instagram that I never answer. If you want to send me either useful things, anger, vitriol and bile, mental illness, whatever else, I get a lot of that on Twitter with open DMs. They can find me at Kyle Seraphin on there and True Social. So I'm pretty easy. I'm always just my name. I didn't get creative with it, but it makes it easy to find. You got the right Kyle Seraphin. There's no additional hyphens or show or anything added. Just at Kyle Seraphin on all those platforms.
Awesome. Kyle, it's been a real pleasure having you here on the show. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it.